honeys, welcome back. Before we begin today's episode, Bewitching Barkeeps, I do have a couple administrative things to take care of, so bear with me. First and foremost is that we will most likely be skipping our Tuesday, June 24th business. Yours truly is moving apartment complexes. It's a long story, but I'll be moving twice this summer. The first of those moves is happening this upcoming weekend, and I am still putting things into place. So you might get the business, you might get it later, you might not get it at all, to be determined. In any case, I am feeling refreshed from yet another weekend of rugby sevens, even though this one came with a bit of a black eye, and ready for the episode, so let's get started. Today we're talking bar scenes, honeys, more specifically, the people who make the bar scenes fun and possible, the bartenders themselves. Even though the inspiration for this episode, my thought process of it's summer, it's party time, let's investigate party time, was a little bit silly, it is important that we're able to trace some of Western art history's most important arts movements through these bar scenes and bartenders. So let's look at each one as a sign of their times and dive in. Our first artwork for the day was created in 1835 by William Sidney Mount, an American artist. It is titled simply Barroom Scene. Now, who was William Sidney Mount? He was born and died in Setauket, New York, a place I have a very special connection to that we'll talk about at a later time. He lived between 1807 and 1868. Mount was raised on a farm until his father's death at age 7, then sent to live with other relatives. He apprenticed to his older brother as a sign painter in New York at one point, mostly studying engraving, and was a member of the National Academy of Design's first cohort in its opening year, 1826. Although Mount established a studio in the city of New York in 1829, he spent most of his life on Long Island, perhaps due to ill health, say our sources, painting portraits of local people and scenes of country life. He even built a studio in a horse-drawn carriage in 1860 so that he could continue to travel among the farms and secretively paint the farmers and common people going about daily life. His legacy is pretty well cemented into art history. Britannica writes that the, quote, recognizable situations and detailed representational character of Mount's paintings struck a responsive chord in Victorian America and now serve as a valuable record of a bygone agrarian age, end quote. Mount is particularly notable for his popularity in his own day. His paintings were well received by the American public of the Jacksonian democracy era because they were so humble, they were skillful, and had a realistic execution. And crucially, says the Spellman Gallery, quote, his serene agrarian paintings were also a welcome contrast to the increasing complexities of the Industrial Revolution, end quote. Mount was not only a success at home, but also abroad. He was among the first American painters to become widely known and circulated throughout Europe, thanks in no small part to a New Yorker, William Schaus, who worked with European dealers at the time. I want to make it clear I'm quoting here because this is not necessarily the language that I would use, but, quote, part of their popularity was the fact that Blacks and their place in American society were included as subjects, reflecting the racial tensions of the late 1850s and 1860s in America, end quote. This insight into the social and racial dynamics of the nation was not only appealing to Americans at home, but to Europeans curious about what exactly that new society across the pond was like. Ultimately, Mount's success rested on his against-the-grain style. Whereas other American artists were very much trying to copy European academic subjects and styles, Mount stuck with the America he knew, the daily lives of East Coast people, and didn't shy away from expressing moralistic as well as political views in his artworks. And now the artwork itself, the barroom scene. The Art Institute of Chicago, owner of the artwork, describes it this way, quote, the central figure in this tavern is a homeless wanderer who literally dances along a line in the floorboards and, as a result, walks a symbolic line between class and race. The color of his skin unites him with the more prosperous men who urge on his drunken revelry, but his poverty makes him an outcast like the African-American man in the shadows, end quote. The man they are referring to there stands in the back corner of the room and, quote, as a free black man in 1830s New York was able to frequent the public tavern, but, as Mount makes clear visually, did not participate fully or equally in this community, end quote. These are exactly the sort of racial, social tensions that were in fact going on in this nation and that were so captivating to see captured on canvas. At the same time that it speaks to daily public life and general social interactions, the artwork exactly describes the different layers, the different hierarchies of American society at this point, where someone's economic status may put them lower than one group, but their racial status may put them above another. And the painting really makes it clear that these dynamics are its focus. The background is super sparse with no pictures on the wall, just plain brown matching floor ceilings. There are a few discarded jugs, and just the corner of the bar is visible along the left-hand side, but the outlines of the figures forms a rough triangle in the center, and that's just about where our eyes stay. The most notable thing about this particular barroom scene is that the bartender is conspicuous by their absence. For all the racial, social, economic exploration here, we still see the chosen omission of a lower-class person, the essential servant, so to speak, making the revelers' joy and drinking possible. Since the work is widely seen as an exploration of both temperance and the abolition of slavery, it's possible that the lack of a visible, distinguishable bartender is meant to indicate a lack of self-control or authority figure, a lack of minding one's own drinking. Instead, our focus is redirected to the unsupervised interactions of these various status, various class people within the painting. I'm left to wonder, honeys, how would the inclusion of a barkeep figure change the events being seen here and/or our reading of the work? Would we view these revelers as a little bit more contained, or would they continue to be kind of sloppy looking as they currently are? The work is slightly comparable to Mount's piece called Cider Making from 1840 through 41 in that both address some part of the alcohol making and/or imbibing process, but it is much more similar to Mount's 1837 work titled The Tough Story Scene in a Country Tavern. The National Gallery of Art summarizes that piece by saying, quote, "A disheveled figure with knee and head injuries and a crutch sits in a mostly empty tavern. Holding a glass of hard cider, he tells his tale to the tavern keeper, the younger man across from him. Behind them, a third man seems to be listening but keeping his distance. A railroad schedule on the wall suggests the standing figure will soon travel on. As the artist explained, the older man persists in entertaining his young landlord with the longest story. Having fairly tired out every other frequenter of the establishment, Mount was a visual storyteller whose keen observations of American life captured the public's imagination," end quote. Both barroom scene and Scene in a Country Tavern create a sense of movement and dynamism through the positioning of legs, especially by crossing them, which draws the eye into these diagonals formed. But Scene in a Country Tavern appears to be set in a much smaller room or tavern. It's more red in tone than yellow, and still some class differences are visible in the clothing differences, but not as highly emphasized, I would say. The 1837 piece features a wood stove and other scattered dice and objects, which provide us with a shift in format and a shift in the source of entertainment in this tavern, even though this room, like the other, is relatively plain. While the bottles and bar top of Barroom Scene are put to the side, they're still pretty frontal, but in this piece, they're tucked entirely into the shadows of the right background. With the exception of the mostly empty glass in the injured man's hand, the drinking is only indicated by some discarded glasses and does not appear to be happening in the exact moment of the painting. Another major difference, there is no backgrounded figures in the country tavern scene, but there's some parallels to Barroom Scene in that the brown-coated dude in this work has his hat over his face like the background character does in Barroom. And honeys, this is another instance of find the bartender. They may be just out of our view behind the bar, which is so backgrounded, or it could even be the brown-cloaked person or another one of the figures, but we just don't know. Either way, omitting that servant figure, the bartender figure here, again forces us to focus on the interpersonal dynamics of the clients, of the people drinking. Mount was exceptional at picking the right figures to show the realities of American society and interpersonal interaction at this time. But we also see his own faults, the fallacies of his day, by not including the figure that is possibly of lowest class but most responsible for the enjoyment of everyone else, the barkeep. For our next painting, we jump ahead to 1882 for Edouard Manet's A Bar at the Folies Bergère. Manet was born and died in Paris, living January of 1832 through April of 1883. He had early hopes of becoming a naval officer, following in his dad's footsteps, but twice failed the entrance exams for training school, so pursued the arts instead. He studied with the celebrated Thomas Couture from 1850 to 1856 and simultaneously drew at the Académie Suisse, often copying from old masters at the Louvre. After leaving Couture's studio, Manet traveled extensively throughout Europe. Manet's story is one of very slow success, however. He was rejected from the official 1859 Paris Salon, but Eugene Delacroix later intervened on his behalf, so he was accepted into the 1861 edition, where Manet received favorable press. He began exhibiting at the Galerie Martinet in Paris afterwards and had 3 works featured in the Salon des Refuses of 1863, including Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, a work we'll cover as a comparison point. Continuing with our brief bio here, Manet's artworks, Olympia and Christ Mocked, were greeted with great hostility when shown at the Salon of 1865, but they also cemented him into the art historical canon via controversy. After that year, Manet began to regularly travel Europe again and spent lots of time in Spain. Despite this, Manet continued to struggle for acceptance from the academics, the quote-unquote official art world, for a long time. He was rejected from the Salon of 1866 and not invited to the Exposition Universelle of 1867. In response, says the Met, quote, Manet used his inheritance to construct a pavilion across the street from one of the entrances to the Exposition Universelle. Inside were 50 of his pictures, including several large works now in the Met's collection, end quote. Despite some stylistic similarities, he declined to show with the Impressionists in their first exhibition in 1874, but from 1879 to 1882, he participated annually at the Salon and finally seemed to be getting that recognition that he was after. This success was solidified by his winning of a second-class medal at the Salon of 1881 for his portrait of Henry Rochefort, maybe, in the spring, and in the fall he was made a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor. And now that you know about the artist, we'll turn to the artwork, which was painted only a year before Manet's death. In this painting, we're met immediately with the stare of a maybe bored, maybe apprehensive barmaid with sort of distant look on her face as she seems to wait to take our order, and in the expansive mirror behind her, we can see the reflection of cabaret goers bustling between seats, the sort of crazy Parisian atmosphere, the evening time of fun. Let's first focus on the fact that the Folies Bergère was an actual place. Writes the BBC, quote, opened in 1869, the Folies Bergère was a lively venue for trapeze performances and vaudeville and variety theater, and it was famed for the mirrors that lined its walls, creating a magic lantern-like effect, end quote. Furthermore, the model herself was a real person named Susan, and she worked in the club, but for this image, modeled in the artist's studio where he set up a bar to create the painting after. It's notable that Manet has grounded this piece in a location that actually exists in the real world and references the real social goings-on of Paris at the time. In some ways, this bit of realism mirrors Mount's barroom scene, but in others, the level of revelry, the level of optical illusion created by the mirrors is much more intense. Even though it references very real things, this artwork is also often seen very metaphorically as an advertisement and also as a criticism of consumerism at the same time. Let's consider the fact that the name of the theater is given, but the name of the model is not in the title of this artwork. We're immediately led to believe as a viewer that the place, that the location, the fun that it provides is more important than the actual person pouring our drinks for our enjoyment. Furthermore, this piece is generally regarded, says Artsy, as, quote, one of the first uses of product placement, end quote, because of the visibility as well as the specificity of the bottles and their labels on either side of the barmaid. And there's a fascinating contextual reason for this. According to ArtNet, the late 1800s was the dawn of the department store and a new style of sales display, an art of it almost. ArtNet writes, quote, the space of the Folies Bergère had originally opened as a home goods store specializing in bedding with an attractions room in the back to attract customers, end quote, but it was later converted to be only a theater. The composition of the bar here mimics that sort of store counter look and speaks to that major department store feel and thus the consumerism of the day. When we think a little further about that department store sort of setting, we also realize that everything about the bartender's appearance would have been chosen by her bosses to appeal to the taste of the customers, in all puns. I make this note because of my next point. We know that there's some product placement here because the brown bottle next to her with a red triangle on its logo matches up exactly with the shape and logo of the Bass Brewery, which, quote, had become the first company to register a trademark in the UK in 1876, end quote. Manet's signature is also scrawled across a beer bottle nearby to the Bass Brewery bottle. Artsy argues that the close placement there, quote, calls into question the commercial nature of the art industry, end quote. BBC, for their part, argues that Manet anticipated in this way the sort of product placement, everyday consumer item preoccupations of the pop artists. They even argue that Manet did it better. The important thing about Manet's reference to real consumer goods is that he wasn't the only one doing it. Many of his contemporaries did it through fashion instead. For example, we have the painter Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, who took a commission from the Moulin Rouge to create 6-foot-tall posters advertising the new cabaret in 1891. We have Edgar Degas' 27-work collection of paintings depicting Paris millinery shops. We also have Berthe Morisset's and Claude Monet's depictions of Parisian women dressed in their finest going about town. But we can consider Manet's product placement in this image of the Folie Bergère as a bit more complicated because Manet chooses to echo this tiny red label with a red flower arrangement, triangular in shape, pinned to the bartender's bosom. A lot of our sources for the day saw this as a way to hint at the realities of French society and sexual availability in it at the time. Quote, as art scholar and author Kelly Grovier wrote for the BBC, this detail is critical to understanding the composition. Many of the barmaids at the Folie Bergère were sex workers, and it can be inferred that this woman is being sexually propositioned by the man on the right side of the painting. His reflection serves as a stand-in for the audience, who is also objectifying the woman through the sheer act of spectating upon her as art, end quote. Manet chooses to echo this triangle shape in other parts of the painting, the chandelier shape, the shape of the absinthe bottle, the woman's yellow gloves in the background. The combination of all of these triangles suggests that the barmaid, like these other objects, is a consumer item meant for the pleasure of others. Artnet even goes as far as to say that, quote, Manet too habitually associated oranges with prostitution, which here are piled high on the counter, end quote. So ultimately what we have here is Manet drawing connections between the sexual tensions of Parisian society and its overhaul as a consumer one at the same time. By depicting this barmaid / potential sex worker on such a grand scale as the main subject, he introduces a sort of morally fraught contemporary one into the realm of high art. Furthermore, we have her direct gaze acknowledging our sort of voyeurism, our consuming of her. And that direct look back into the viewer's eyes combined with the hints of sexual availability is exactly the type of thing that Manet did in earlier paintings like Olympia and Déjeuner sur l'herbe, which was so upsetting to French society, the academy, the arts world at the time because it was a big no-no. Women were only meant to be consumed by the male gaze. They were meant to be passive objects to be appreciated. And in this case, the barmaid, though she's presented as a consumer item, she doesn't let herself be objectified quite so easily. Another key fact about this painting is that a close look at that mirror background hints at the possibility of multiple realities occurring at once, or at least the potential of a scene playing out. Daily Art magazine considers this as a commentary by Manet on the nature of painting itself. Quote, since the Renaissance, painting had to depict life accurately, such as what we see in a mirror. Manet disagrees with that opinion and embraces subjectivity, stating that everything is a matter of perspective, end quote. The biggest example of this matter of perspective approach to painting is seen in how, from our head-on gaze, the woman appears to rest her hands, wrist out, onto the counter, but in the reflection, she leans towards the man ordering from her, whose point of view we occupy as he leans into her. It is obviously not possible for her to be occupying these two different bodily positions at the same time, so there must be something more going on here. The famed art historian T.J. Clark argues that the difference between the two bodily positions signals, quote, the dawn of a new social order under capitalism. This new order, Clark argued, upended time-honored roles and social dynamics and offered a paradoxical, topsy-turvy world as disorienting as the reflection in Manet's painted scene, end quote. Clark also argued that the double perspective, double view, signals the double entendre of the barmaid herself being for sale. And here we once again refer to her distant, unfocused gaze and the position of her body behind the bar, the object between us and her. Many art historians have argued that by doing this, by denying us this closeness we see in the couples mingling in the mirror reflection, we're being denied a sort of access to the barmaid herself. We're being denied the sort of intimacy that her potential work as a sex worker would provide to us. Though the debate continues to rage about exactly why her gaze is so unfocused. Another notable argument comes from Albert Bayaume in his essay Manet's Un bar à folie bergère as an allegory of nostalgia, wherein the author suggests that it's because the mirror actually shows us the fantasy in this barmaid's head of being rescued by and becoming a customer living luxuriously instead of watching from behind the bar as an employee. On the other hand, her inaccessibility, her being trapped behind the bar, may have to do with Manet's own limitations at the time. He was so sick that he had to paint while seated for the first time in his life, and again, this painting was made within a year of his death. To this point, ArtNet writes, quote, his ailment forced Manet into a physical stasis not totally unlike the barmaid trapped behind the counter. His thoughts, like her thoughts, become the primary avenue for escape and exploration, end quote. And one last thing that I think is really worth pointing out here, the bartender, of course, is not the only woman in this image, but the range of women represented in this space is meaningful in and of itself. Our sources write, quote, while the barmaid offers one of the shifting identities of this era, a petite bourgeois not so readily definable in her dress as belonging to a particular class, the trapeze artist in green boots, which identify her as Leona Dare, a female trapeze artist from Louisiana, offers another vision of women's place in 1882 Paris. In this way, the trapeze artists, the barmaids and servers, and the female clientele formed a nexus of possibilities of women watching and being watched as the turn of the century approached, end quote. Manet even references the question of visibility and being noticed in this way, the display of wealth and status, by specifically including a woman holding a pair of binoculars. Quote, not only does she want to be seen that evening, she is also trying to figure out who else attended, who is accompanying whom, and what the rest of the attendants are wearing, end quote. So we see just how tightly knit this social network was, just how important looks and dress and other consumer signals were to the French in terms of understanding social hierarchy within public space. By representing not only the possibilities for women of multiple classes, multiple statuses at this time, but also encapsulating the idea of woman as a commercial object within that same society and within art history, Manet really loaded this particular barkeep with a lot of meaning and a lot of criticism of the society and art history as a whole. Our next image for the day is Vincent van Gogh's The Night Cafe from 1888. Van Gogh, as I'm sure you're aware, was a Dutch artist who lived 1853 to 1890, and as we covered in our Indomitable Mrs. Bonger episode, he came from a simple background, wanted to be a pastor like his father. In 1885 through 86, he attended the academy in Antwerp, and on his return to Paris in 1886, he met and began regular interactions with artists like Degas, Gauguin, Eau, and Seurat, and as a result, he began painting more post-impressionistically. In this artwork, the bar is mostly empty for a change, that may be because it is a quarter past midnight according to the clock on the far wall. The billiards table has been completely reset, and the few who remain are half slumped over their empty glasses. Once again, our bartender is notable by their apparent absence, although I would argue he might be the person in white standing on the other side of the pool table from us. Like in Mount's barroom scene, we do not have an authority figure visible among them, but unlike both that work and Folie Bergère, there's no main roles occupied by any of the people visible. It's significant that we're being told by Van Gogh that we are looking at a nighttime bar scene, whereas Mount and Manet kind of leave that up to interpretation. Van Gogh's communication to us that this is nighttime gives us an important bit of context because it allows us to understand that these are what Van Gogh called night prowlers, those in his opinion who, quote, have no money to pay for a lodging or are too drunk to be taken in, end quote. The current owner of this artwork, the Yale University Galleries, writes, quote, the clashing colors were also meant to express the, inner quotes, terrible passions of humanity, end inner quote, found in this all-night haunt populated by vagrants and prostitutes, and all quotes. So Van Gogh is trying to communicate to us through these sparse, huddled together characters a potentially dangerous scene, one that survives on vice. This is a really interesting assumption for Van Gogh to make of these people, especially given how relatively poor his mental health became afterwards, the asylum residencies that he ended up in. In fact, this work was painted only 6 months after his move to Arles in the interest of his health. And once he moved there, he was not immune to the charms of the night prowler's haunts either, writes Medium, quote, as he became accustomed to life in the town, occasionally visited by other artists traveling down from the north of France, he began to take to the bars and brothels of Arles himself, end quote. The very impersonal, almost dangerous tone of the work may be a result of Van Gogh's own unfamiliarity with these spaces and his curiosity about the allure of them, as well as the potential pitfalls of spending an extensive amount of time in a bar. That may be why we see this space as mostly empty with little to distinguish class, gender, etc., and that may be why the white-suited gentleman on the other side of the pool table, the one I think looks kind of like a bartender figure, is the most clean-cut and groomed, yet his face is not distinct. You can't tell any of the features. To Van Gogh, each one of these characters may have been as threatening as the last. Yet despite his indistinct facial features, we can tell that that one bartender figure is meeting our gaze. And that leaves me wondering, honeys, is that just acknowledgement of a new patron ourselves entering the bar? Is that because he is meant to be serving us and he's not where he should be at this time? Or is this meant to indicate that this bartender figure matters more or less than the patrons, hence our inability to ID him? In any case, we cannot tell who any of these people are meant to be, making them a little less real, but also a little more inaccessible and anonymous in the sort of sense one might like to be in a shadowy bar. And honeys, if it turns out I'm wrong, the guy in white is not a bartender figure, that just means once again we have no authority figure here, which again indicates the potential volatility, the potential lawlessness of this particular barroom scene. Interestingly, Van Gogh sort of takes after Manet here in that there are intentionally done perspective mismatches in this piece as well. There are a lot of complex angles, and our ability to enter, suggested by the interior placement of our POV, is somewhat blocked from the painting's bar space via the giant semi-sideways pool table. The entire space of the room looks as though it is leaning towards the back left corner, and the floor itself looks like it might be slightly dipping in the middle. But our source is right that the effect of this altered perspective is, quote, also to draw us into the painting. The lines of the room slope and converge upon the curtained doorway at the back. This doorway becomes a focal point, a mysterious promise of an inner sanctum, end quote. Yet there's no one visible within that so-called sanctum, only some uncertain furniture pieces. That space also looks shallow and has either a green curtain or another door visible right in its center. The collapsing of that back room space makes this room feel even more short, even smaller. But for all that, it also appears to be better lit. The lighting in there is bright yellow, the walls are yellow, whereas in the main room that we are standing in, the lamps emit a yellow light, sure, but the walls are red. We appear to have to pass through this darker, more dangerous, uncertain, occupied zone in order to get to that inner sanctum. The contrast between the two rooms within the same painting heightens the sense of risk, and we know this is intentional because our sources even quote Van Gogh himself saying, quote, "In my picture of the night cafe, I have tried to express the idea that the cafe is a place where one can destroy oneself, go mad, or commit a crime. In short, I have tried to express the powers of darkness in a common tavern," end quote. So this bar scene is entirely about the potential for things to go wrong. We understand that entertainment is meant to be a focal point here, especially considering the size and the placement of the pool table and the fact that its shadow is almost twice as big as the table itself. It takes up the better part of the visible bar space. And, of course, we have all those different groups of people interacting with their table mates. Yet, there's very specific and set distances between every grouping of people that we see here. And, potentially the most interesting feature in my opinion, the bar at the back has flowers and many bottles, yet no one stands near it. It has relatively little counter space given the size of the bar room itself. Furthermore, most of the bottles are half full or empty, as are the glasses, and there are many more of them at the tables than there are people. Perhaps Van Gogh is telling us through these empty or half-empty glasses that the source of entertainment has changed, or maybe that people have kind of tired of drinking for the night. In any case, it's an interesting thing to have a specific barroom scene and nobody actively drinking heavily. But shifting back from the meaning of the image to the technical parts of it for a minute, this one is important as one of many attempts at the paradoxical artistic task of representing night by light. In some ways, it does follow the trends set by the Impressionists to capture tone, mood, and movement of lighting as well as people, but as I kind of pointed out, the yellow tones are everywhere in this image. They're present in the clothing, the skin of the patrons, the floor, and are meant to represent the effect of the yellow lamps surrounding the ceiling edges. That Van Gogh was able to successfully create this effect in this work just speaks to his deep understanding of color. And to close out this artwork, we'll talk about its pretty fascinating ownership backstory. In 2016, the Supreme Court ruled against the heir of the original owner, who was the Russian industrialist Ivan Morozov, saying that the $200 million artwork, at that time, would remain in the U.S. at the Yale University Art Gallery. The court found that the claim made by the heir, Pierre Konowaloff, was faulty because it did not belong to Morozov after 1918. This despite the fact that 1918 was the year that the Bolshevik Party took power and, quote, "Following the October Revolution in 1917, Vladimir Lenin singled out Morozov's collection for nationalization, and the state displayed the seized works in the Second Museum of Modern Western Painting." Konowaloff had been fighting since 2008 to reclaim the painting and told Moscow Times prior to the ruling, quote, "I am fighting for the memory of my great-grandfather. I want the night cafe returned to its rightful place because I know just how much my great-grandfather missed his collection," end quote. Ultimately, the Supreme Court's decision was due to the fact that, except in certain Nazi-related World War II cases, quote, "The U.S. cannot overturn property seizures enacted by foreign governments, even though the U.S. did not recognize Soviet rule until 1933, end quote. And that, honeys, is Vincent van Gogh's The Night Cafe of 1888. Moving along to potentially our most famous piece of the day, Edward Hopper's Nighthawks from 1942. Hopper was born in and died in New York in 1882 and 1967, respectively. He grew up in a town on the west side of the Hudson River in a middle-class family that encouraged his artistic abilities. He studied briefly at the Correspondence School of Illustrating in New York City from 1899 to 1900 after high school and before enrolling in classes at the New York School of Art from 1900 to 1906. He studied with leading American Impressionist painter William Merritt Chase as well as the artist Robert Henry. Shortly after, he made 3 trips abroad and in 1924 married fellow artist Josephine, also known as Jo, Verstyle Nevison. Hopper became a master etcher to help cover the bills and soon achieved exhibition success and then commercial in 1930 when his painting House by the Railroad from 1925 was the first work to be acquired for the collections of the newly founded Museum of Modern Art. In 1933, Hopper received further critical recognition as the subject of a MoMA retrospective. He was, quote, by then celebrated for his highly identifiable mature style in which urban settings, New England landscapes, and interiors are all pervaded by a sense of silence and estrangement, end quote. Hopper continued to work and achieve increasing success and fame, making new technical accomplishments and so on until the reign of the abstract expressionists began in the 40s and 50s. And so, the artwork itself, the Nighthawks. We're going to start a little bit bigger picture here because it is so symbolic symbolic and so representative of Hopper's entire style, his themes. The Whitney noted the effects of geography and general American sentiment, that sort of thing, on his works' moods as well as content. They go on to say he was most inspired by the locations he spent most of his time, downtown New York where he lived and worked, and Cape Cod where, beginning in 1934, he maintained a second home and studio. The Whitney writes, quote, "A reflective and individualistic man, he was deeply attuned to the relationship of the self to the world, and his works increasingly focused on the psychological realities of his subjects," end quote. Our other sources agree that this is a symbol of Hopper to the T. Artsy.net points out how much it shows his noirish cinematic style, his taking up of somewhat voyeuristic perspectives, and his emphasis on dramatic interactions of light and shadow, as well as, quote, "emotionally isolated figures that inhabit anonymous urban spaces, roadside diners, gas stations, hotels," end quote. And some of those techniques, specifically the dramatic lighting, lead us into our art historical timeline connections. As you may have guessed, this piece somewhat follows in the footsteps of the Van Gogh work and the Impressionists because of its emphasis on especially yellow lighting effects. Because of this, the Walker Art Center says, Hopper's paintings are often strongly cinematic, but they never offer a totally clear narrative. Instead, they seem like snapshots of real people in one moment. They seem to indicate the artist's curiosity about his fellow man and how we all move through the world. Also, because fluorescent lighting was just becoming a popular thing for commercial and public spaces, this would have been a more quote-unquote modern lighting exploration. Hopper's Nighthawks has been linked explicitly to Van Gogh's Cafe Terrace at Night even, and that artwork was on show in New York in January of 1942, so it's very possible that not only did Hopper see it, but he was inspired by it to focus on the indoor lighting effect of outdoor spaces that it spills into, as we see here in Nighthawks. Our sources also say that this piece ties into the Freudian idea of the uncanny often found in surrealism, popular at the time. Artnet writes, quote, "According to Freud, this strange, not quite right feeling manifests in the transformation of something once familiar into the threateningly foreign. Here, the sprawling windows, while protective during the day, expose the figures' vulnerability by night. In contrast, the dark second-story windows of the adjacent building conceal the possibility of a threat lurking inside," end quote. By taking this generally familiar setting, a bar at nighttime, and making it feel so strange, so singular, so unusual, by straining the personal relationships within and having these cinematic lighting effects with no clear narrative, Hopper manages to create that sense of the uncanny and make us believe that there might be something wrong here. There might be something worth our worry, or at least explain the worry of the characters we see within, their stiffness. It's also notable that with this image, Hopper sticks with the figural in the midst of the tide of abstract. It was, quote-unquote, set not far from his actual neighborhood in Manhattan, and, the Whitney writes, quote, "At a time when many artists in New York had turned to abstraction, Hopper pushed his compositions further than ever before in his charged images of cafeterias, theaters, offices, and apartment bedrooms," end quote. So here we have another instance of going against the grain and being all the more successful for it. Additionally, say our sources, literary connections exist between this painting and other textual artworks. According to Artnet, the art historian and Hopper authority, Gail Levin, has linked both the setting and this very suspenseful mood of the image to Ernest Hemingway's 1927 short story, The Killers. That story is also set in a diner at night and follows two hitmen as they seek out their target. Quote, "Hopper admired the piece enough to send a letter of support to the editor of Scribner's shortly after it ran, calling it, quote, an honest piece of work," end all quotes. The inspiration being a hitman story might explain the tone of this painting. And as much as it may have been inspired by a story, it also inspired new ones. Joyce Carol Oates went on to develop a backstory for the man and woman in her 1989 poem called Edward Hopper's Nighthawks, 1942. And now back to what exactly is going on here. We see all kinds of societal tensions embodied in this work. The avoidance of naming a clear location where exactly this bar is, what the name of it is, no clear narrative, no even interpersonal connection connections between the characters. The Met writes, quote, "In Hopper's most iconic painting, four customers and a waiter inhabit the brightly lit interior of a city diner at night. They appear lost in their own weariness and private concerns, their disconnection perhaps echoing the wartime anxiety felt by the nation as a whole," end quote. Many have focused on the stiffness and apparent loneliness of these self-contained characters, as well as the amount of empty space inside and outside the bar as significant and as symbolic of this loneliness. As much as Hopper is continuing to explore his chosen themes here, ones like the tensions between individuals, particularly men and women, conflicts between tradition and progress in both rural and urban settings of America at the time, moods evoked by various times of the day even, he's not afraid to show us these powerful senses of isolation that were also a factor of America at the time, even during this, quote, "era of national prosperity and cultural optimism," end quote. The Art Institute of Chicago points out that despite the lack of interaction between the characters, this is one of very few works of Hopper's featuring multiple and not a single subject. This is a meaningful choice intended to draw attention to the lack of relationships. That sense of loneliness, as well as separation between the viewer and the artwork characters, is enhanced by, one, the lack of a visible door or open window. We literally cannot get to them. There's also no eye contact or acknowledgement from anyone within the painting of our somewhat voyeurism. There's also a lack of any other light source in the work. The cool tones that we are stuck in outside contrast with the warm tones inside and also separate us from them. The compositional choices for Nighthawks are also very much tied to the World War II realities of empty social spaces as people went to war or to work for war. It speaks to the citywide blackout orders and dimmed public spaces that were also a reality of this time. Some of our sources say that the work was made while Hopper walked around the darkened New York City shortly after the Pearl Harbor attacks and imagined what such spaces would look like if they were occupied. And another more potentially personal notable detail about this artwork, Hopper used his wife Jo as the model for the red-headed woman and himself as the model for the man with his back turned to us, according to the Art Institute of Chicago. By using himself and his wife as models, Hopper may have suggested some loneliness between them as well. And the thing that potentially separates us from them, the characters in the artwork, I mean, is the sense of time, the sense of location. Even though it's not exactly clear where in the US this is, there's no street signs or anything, we know that it is somewhere in the past. There's nostalgia evoked by the dress styles we see there. The old-fashioned coffee and bar machinery evokes the same feelings. Yet for all that, the work has a certain timelessness to its flat color planes and the fact that bars, coffee shops still exist everywhere in the world today. In some ways, Hopper is summarizing the entirety of America via the experience of this simplified stock diner with minimal symbols of consumer culture and wartime culture. The presence of the cash register, napkin holders are all very downplayed, and we already talked about those blackout order connections. There's no clock on the wall or any indication of time, so time remains a very big question in this painting. It feels suspended in a certain moment, but we don't know when that moment is. Fortunately, I was able to find a few comparables to give us even more insight into this work. The first is the study for Nighthawks, and there are some pretty notable differences. The first was that the name of the bar posted on a board above it, Phillies, is not present in the final. The study shows further etchings on the window, which may have indicated time or place, and more objects in the background windows as well. Together, those things suggest a more present human reality and a greater sense of time and place. But also in that study, the windows are less translucent, so we can see less of the actual inside of the cafe. We also notice slightly different body proportions and or positions in the study, though they are still mostly separated. So what we see here is that Hopper originally intended for us to have a greater idea of where we were, but he sacrificed that in the end to heighten the tension between the characters and with ourselves. I'd also like to draw our attention to an artwork made by him 12 years earlier titled Early Sunday Morning. Both paintings appear to be set in front of the red brick apartments of New York's villages and show us an hour of the day when people are typically not awake. This one was also painted at a historically important moment, the beginning of the Great Depression, and, according to Smart History, quote, "Early Sunday morning produces a sense of ease in the viewer, not anxiety," end end quote, because this one presents a world that is about to bustle with the life hinted at by the frilly awnings, the brightly colored barber's pole, the squat fire hydrant, the open windows. Nighthawks, while using very similar streetscapes, not only hints at but shows the opposite. And our last one from Hopper for the day is called Western Motel. It was made in 1957, and maybe because it was painted late in Hopper's career, it illustrates the artist's really unique fusion at that point of the figurative with the abstract. In it, a burgundy-dressed woman sits in a pretty sparely furnished motel. She's framed by this huge window that looks out onto a loose arrangement of blue-gray forms, maybe rolling hills. We can see through the window the front bumper of a green car, and her packed suitcase is standing upright, ready to go in the foreground. So we're meant to read this as a woman who is in the midst of traveling. What's interesting about this image is that even though it has a ton of Hopper's sort of trademarks, an anonymous space, environment, and isolated figure, this one does not seem to portray loneliness so much as it portrays the enjoyment of one's own company, the peace with being alone. It seems as though this woman is enjoying the traveling through her own mind, maybe her own space, her own preoccupations in the world. The focus of this singular character being on herself is a totally different vibe from Nighthawks. And now, honeys, our very last artwork for the day, one by Guy Buffet, called The Making of a Perfect Martini. This one is dated to 1993 or 2000, depending on exactly the source you ask. Buffet was a French-American born in 1943 and who died in 2023. Buffet's father died when he was 12, and at age 14, he moved to southern France with his mother. He enlisted shortly after in the Beaux-Arts School of Toulon to study art full-time, but to stay in the region, had to work in restaurants and bars, hence his later subject matter. Buffet explored the world by joining the Navy at age 18 in 1961. He moved to Hawaii and San Francisco for periods of time before being commissioned by numerous corporations, including Aloha Airlines, Grand Marnier, Absolute Vodka, the Ritz-Carlton Hotels, Williams-Sonoma, all kinds of businesses to produce more promotional work for them. So, honeys, it's possible you may have seen something of his and not even known it. Now, the reason I wanted to include The Making of a Perfect Martini today was, one, it was the entire inspiration for this episode. I realized, wait a second, there's a dozen and one images of bars or bartenders in art history. We could do that. And second, I just loved the actual style of this work, the division of the canvas into 9 equal squares, each one showing a stage of making a martini, and the gestural emphasis of this painting drew me in as well. You can see multiple echoes of not only the bartender's face, but also his shaker or the different bottles within the same frame. The sense of wild, crazy shaking motion that the bartender is doing here is captured so well and in such a humorous way as the bartender's face shifts from expression to expression within each panel and the bottles go flying around. The intense red background of the piece also highlights and heightens the energy of the bartender and his movement. And there's a connection between this piece and Bar at Folie Bergère in the sense that the bottles are pretty clearly labeled. I don't necessarily recognize what those brands are, but I'm sure somebody else might. The bartender looks like a personable person here. He's smiling in most of the frames and has a real sense of humanism and dynamism about him that I love. And this is true of the majority of Buffet's artworks and our comparables for today. In Goose Martini with an Orange Twist, we again see 9 panels, each describing the different process of adding something to the shaker or the shaking of the drink itself. A similar thing happens in Una Margarita, Por Favor, although the background colors and the exact bottles visible and all that changes from image to image. It's not quite the same bartender each time. Buffet's pieces seem to be centered on entertainment, on personality, on friendliness of that bartender who is apparently making you, the viewer whose eyes he connects with, a drink. In that way, I think it does speak to actual bartending work today. Your girl is also a server on the side, and there is definitely a sort of friendliness, a sort of energy that you are meant to project, a certain entertainment value you are supposed to provide your guests. And in these works, Buffet really captures that energy and that persona that we are all asked to put on. And with this artwork explored, honeys, we wrap up for the day. If there's one thing that I think we have learned together today, it's that bartenders as public servants, as public figures, as representations of consumerism and or personality, societal concerns, whatever the case may be, that's been a thing for a very long time. And artists continue to evolve the meaning of their artworks, the bar scene, the bartender in art history by continuing to not only project various moral lessons or societal truths through them, it also matters to an artwork's reading just how distinct, how unique of an individual that particular bartender is. Whether they are male or female, whether they are interacting with customers or with us, the viewer, or whether they're not even there at all, the barkeep has been able to tell us something about American or even French or any other society time and time again. I hope you enjoyed listening to this a bit extra long episode as much as I enjoyed making it for you. We're going to leave things there for now. Remember to hydrate or dehydrate as it is continually getting hotter and hotter like Satan's armpit, and continue to take care of yourselves throughout this intense summer heat. We'll talk again as soon as I have the bandwidth and the wherewithal. That's all for now. This podcast is produced, created, hosted, formerly edited, and fact-checked by master's degree holder Celia Bugno. Chris Meinhold is responsible for our editing, mixing, and our intro and outro music. Special thanks to him for that. And as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, comment, so on all your favorite listening as well as social media channels.